Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with another episode of Receivables Roundtable. Today, I'm here with my very close friend. I'm going to call him a mentor and just an all-around guy who looks at things differently around the receivables management industry, Mr. Aristotle Sangalang, who is the president of the Bureaus Incorporated. How you doing today, Aristotle?
I'm well. How are you, Adam? Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I greatly appreciate you coming on and having a chat with me today. I know your time is very valuable, but I've learned a lot from you through the years on data analytics and how to look at that as an executive. And that's really where I wanted to focus our discussion today. But before we get to that, for anybody who has not been as lucky as me to be one of your mentees through the years, could you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and how you got to the seat that you're in today?
That's a good story to tell. It's quite a journey that I went through. I was in the collection space for a couple of years before I came to the bureaus. I worked for the state of Illinois initially as a skip tracer when I was 20 years old, and then I worked at a collection agency, a local collection agency, really small medical clients. That it just wasn't my fit. I wasn't as well suited for medical collections. And then I saw the bureaus, which was right by my house at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to apply there. I got the job. I was a collector in 1996. I did things very differently than most of the collectors. Back then, you walk into a call center and you just heard a buzz. It was just loud.
Mm-hmm.
There was no Reg F. FDCPA was, 20 some odd years old at the time. People were really walking the gray line. I would say gray line, but I always had a different mentality. Most of my peers at the time were very heavy into, more of a heavy-handed,
Approach.
talk-off style. Yeah. And I was more like, instead of framing it like, framing it adversarially, why don't we just make it like we're here to make solutions? And so, that's what I did is, I would identify unique things, that the person had, and I would approach them with that knowledge. And so, I did that for a while. Then I figured out a way how to do it systemically. Or I had the idea of doing it systemically, and I was the only one doing it. And so at the time, my manager and Michael Slocky, the CEO, they were interested in what I was doing on my individual queue, and they asked me if I wanted to do that for everybody else, like create that same kind of strategy for everyone else because it was working. And so I did, and so that took me out of the collector seat, put me into a supervisory role. The bureaus started buying bad debt regularly in 1997. At that point, we needed a manager to manage that group. It was growing. So they shifted me over to that. And from that point going forward, I was involved in all the debt purchasing from that day forward. And I haven't looked back. When I became a manager, no one was doing the things that I was doing. Everyone was using a lot of elbow grease. It was more brawn, less brain, more brawn. And I had 30 people at the time, and I couldn't figure out how these managers were coaching their employees. I had 4 assistant managers. I thought that, even with that would not be enough to coach all my people. So I had to figure out a way to identify their shortcomings from information from all the various reports we did on production. At the time, people would look at these reports separately and individually, manually. And so I figured out a way for them, instead of printing the paper, printing the file. And so I would go in and bring the data into an Access database, and I would assess each person to identify where we needed to work. So, for example, if I saw someone was struggling and, I looked at some of those KPIs that we measure and calls per hour, et cetera, if I saw that their calls per hour were satisfactory, or even were, and they were still not collecting any money, I'd say, okay, is that all they're doing is just dialing what's in front of them, or are they trying to figure out a different way to communicate with somebody?
Mhm.
And so then I would be able to identify the specific issue they had. So, for example, if it was being more productive, if it was making more phone calls, if it was doing more skip tracing, if it was, holding firmer or following the negotiations ladder better. These are things that I would
Mhm.
be able to identify quickly, resolve it quickly without having to go through the effort of, okay, let's sit side by side with the collector and watch him and see what happens. That, to
Mhm.
do 30 people, by the time the month ended, by the time I got back to the first person again, they would have already forgot what I taught them, because there's
Not
not
only that,
a,
but
a
how are you
consistent
supposed to keep
the
everybody
amount of time
separate?
you have to spend. Right. And so I said, this is crazy to do all this stuff manually. We've got to figure out a way to do it systemically. And so that's the route I went. And then that opened the floodgates to all sorts of things I wanted to do with data,
Mhm.
because to me, if I could do it with this thing, then I can do it over here. If I could do it for this, I could do it for that. Anywhere I could get data, it was one of those things where if the data is available and I can query it and I can, look at it in different ways, this might be better, for us. But then we stumbled into an issue, which was, well, how do we deal with the credit reports? We could deal with all of the demographic data on our system. We can deal with the stuff that's in our legacy application, but the stuff that's outside of it, like the human readables, credit bureaus, you can't query that data because it's essentially a PDF.
Yeah.
So I went and approached one of the three credit bureaus, and I asked them, we get the human readable, but I would much prefer a flat file. The record having all the data just in one line.
Mhm.
Instead of this nice, pretty form that a collector can read. And they're like, well, why would you want to do that? Well, because the human readable forces me to read it a certain way.
Mhm.
And maybe I don't want to read it that way. And maybe I want to combine a couple of trade lines together or a couple of inquiries together. Well, that's not easy to do. Some people know how to read a credit report real well, some people don't. That's
Mhm.
hard to do. So it took me about a year and a half, but they finally did it. And, since 2000, I want to say 2003, we've been using credit bureau data in that capacity. Then
That's
once that
wild.
happened, yeah, I was doing it for the entire office. Then it turned into, evaluating portfolios. Then it turned into pricing portfolios, and then being involved in all the transactions. So the evolution, if you looked at my 26 years at the bureaus, my hands-on collection time was probably 2 years. You know,
Fair.
um, and then everything else just took off from there. And it was a completely different role. All the roles I had up to president were roles that never existed. They didn't even have a person doing it. It
Mhm.
wasn't important then. Back in those days, people would call my job non-revenue generating because they thought analytics not being on the phone was not generating revenue.
Mhm.
But little did they know we were making less phone calls to get more money. So we were working smarter, not necessarily harder.
Well, it's that forward-thinking
So,
aspect.
that's kind of what we've done since then, since probably 2004 till now, is use data, look at things in a different way. Let's face it, if you buy, an account and it's the same information the people upstream had, you're looking at the exact same thing. Nothing's different. No
Mhm.
view. You don't have a different view. You have the exact same perspective. So what you have to do is find a way to look at it differently than everybody else did. And that's how you find your little niche is you cut out all the inessential items and just identify what you really need. What does this person want? What does this person need? What, and you can find all that stuff out in the credit bureaus, in their behaviors, in the previous action and results, that kind of stuff. But, to do that on an account level, onesie, twosie, is almost impossible. You have to do, it's done effectively in mass.
Well, let me ask you this. How has your vision of data changed as you've gone up the chain of command, right? You were using your data from an operational perspective in that kind of day-to-day onesie twosie type of situation. And now you've kind of evolved into looking at the KPIs and dashboards and things. But how has your vision of data changed over time as your role has changed?
Well, these days, and since not being, a collector, it's been a long time since I've been a collector. I've been looking at things more relative to people, individual personas. You know what I mean? Each consumer has a profile. I mean, and then that's the trick is, you know, people ask, well, what's the job? The job is making contact, right? That's the job.
Mhm.
Collecting money is the end result,
Mhm.
but the job is to make contact. The job is not to make phone calls. The job is to make contact. And so you use the data to find the best way to contact somebody. If you're using, your systems data, maybe you find out what the best times are in the best days of the week to call
Mhm.
certain people. Where do you get the highest contact rate? Years ago, back in 2005, people asked, well, why don't you work on Sundays? And so we gave it a shot, and we analyzed the data, and the data proved out great day to call people. Why? Because they're at home. They're not out. On
Mhm.
Sunday, people are home winding down the weekend, right? They're ready to get their week started. They're available. Um, so what I do is bring pizzas in to incentivize, people to come in, and it ended up working out really well. We don't do that now these days because, our operation has changed dramatically. Back then we had a call
Sure.
center, a full blown call center. We had almost 80 collectors at the time. And, back in 2007, we decided to change that model because it was very hard. We wanted to be able to participate in pools because they were good opportunities, not just because we could handle it.
True
So I
that.
didn't want to be, I didn't want to be limited to only looking at deals that we could digest, right? So
Mhm.
we flipped our strategy. We were working internally 80-90% of the purchase accounts and outsourcing 10 to 20. And I said, well, in order to have more flexibility, and at that time the pools that were for sale were getting larger, 30 million,
Mhm.
50 million, a crack. you know I'm not going to
It's
be
a
able
lot
to
to
handle
digest.
that every single month with a smaller shop. So
Mhm.
I needed a way to be able to participate in every opportunity without feeling like I don't have the infrastructure to handle it. I didn't want that as a factor anymore. I didn't want to have to consider that as a factor because a good deal is a good deal. You want to
Mhm.
be able to make sure that you can benefit from that opportunity. So that's what we did. We then turned our business model into primarily outsourcing and working next to nothing internally. And that made the analytics even more important because now I was dealing with an operation that I couldn't see, right? And I couldn't walk
Mhm.
around necessarily every morning and hear them talking on the phone. So I had to find ways of of creating that same type of ability. And so that's where call logs got submitted and all that stuff I can import and crunch, so that I can get an
Mhm.
understanding of how they're working it. And so that's what we did, and it worked out really well. And we've been very happy with it. And it's It's been very, very stable for us.
Well, it's because you're very patient,
So,
right? So, like as an organization, you guys have been very patient, and through your transition, your movement into some of those data aspects and trying to digest, import, and analyze, right, various blocks of information that
mhm.
you're pulling in from the different organizations. But what I found interesting in kind of looking over your shoulder at different points, throughout this process on consulting engagements or whatever, was that you guys looked at the data a little bit differently, and then you applied what you learned in one place across everything. So as you were looking at these data sets, you'd say, okay, well, in working with agency ABC, we've learned X, Y, and Z are the attributes that drive them, but working with agency XYZ, these are the attributes that are driving them. And then starting to determine which products
Mhm.
to place based on some of those aspects, and right, and how you're managing and
Yep.
controlling that. Has that continued to evolve? Is that still part of your kind of outsourcing strategy today?
Yes, it is. Specialization is what you're talking about. Finding people
Exactly.
who do certain things better than others. We had a company way back when that did skip tracing, and not skip tracing
Hmm.
just finding phone numbers, but skip tracing. And then once they found them, they collected it. So that was their model. Their model was the placements that they would take in were all skips. And not only would they find location information, they would actually collect it for you too. So that was their specialty. They wanted all the accounts that had no contact information, and they did well at it. And so that's what we did. And, for them, that gave them the ability to grow. And we were able to give them, based on the data, not only just every skip, but the skips that were worth working.
Hmm.
And when I say the skips that were worth working, you know, collections is about the ability and the intent, right?
Hmm.
Does the consumer have the
Absolutely.
ability? Does the consumer have the intent? You have to have both, right? You have to look at
Hmm.
both. And the data, will tell you if they have the intent based on previous actions that they did, and the ability, the credit bureau data, and all the other information that's provided to us scoring wise, um, allows for that. We've done a lot of different things with scoring in particular. We created
Hmm.
a minimum payment out of the scoring. Um, One of the things that used to frustrate me with the agencies was, or any collector was, they knew how to ask for the balance. They knew how to ask for balance and payments. They knew how to do the settlements.
Hmm.
They didn't know where to go when that one failed. So if they couldn't SIF or BIF, they didn't know how to approach the payment plan. And so they would go straight to $50 or straight to $25. And the problem with that is, you know, some people can pay more.
Hmm.
And so why would you go straight to the bottom? Then you're not, that's it. There's no negotiating up.
Can't climb back up. Yeah.
That's the number. And then if they can't do that, then what do you have? You have nothing.
Hmm.
So what we did was we created a formula that took into account the scores, the balances, the age of the account, and where in the collection life cycle it was. And
Hmm.
then from that point, we predetermined a minimum payment per consumer.
Hmm.
So it wasn't just like a credit card where it's 3% of the balance and that's your minimum payment. No, it was based on their ability to pay. So you could have $1,000 balance account, but the minimum payment shows up at 250.
Hmm.
Well, you wouldn't have offered someone that if you didn't have that guide. You would have gone lower.
Yeah.
But since you come with 250 as my minimum, they say, no, I can't do it. Okay, I put you on a hardship. Now I go to 50. Well,
Hmm.
if you go to 50 right away, there's nothing. And you're not going to go back. If you're having a bad month, you're not going to go back to these individuals and ask them to increase it. You're not going to do
No,
that. You're going to alienate.
once you've made that offer, you're locked in. Like that's you're now part
Exactly.
of, like
So
that's what it is
if you
now.
go to the bottom, if you negotiate yourself to the bottom right away, that's it. It's over.
Yeah, you're putting yourself in a
They
very
have
difficult situation.
guidance for their settlements, because agencies get settlement authority. Well, why don't they get one for minimum payment? You know, why shouldn't they get one for minimum payment? They should.
Well, it feels like
We
these
do
are the
the same
kinds of
thing
things
for
that you're,
settlements. All of our stuff.
I was gonna say, this seems like the
I'm
kind of
sorry.
thing
Go
that you
ahead.
guys are learning from the analytics itself, right? So you're identifying from the data
Yes.
sets that are in front of you what these, what the probability is of these items, and leveraging multiple scores, bringing that data together as an executive and analyzing it. You've got ops doing it,
Yes.
kind of one by one, and you're looking at aggregate data sets.
Yes. I mean, we also created a tool, and you're familiar with this. It's one of the things that we talked about when you first opened ComplyArm.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we created a program that essentially dummied down everything, put everything in English. There was no, special codes or whatever, the collector shorthand or whatever. Everything was written in English. And the idea there was, I wanted to be able to hire collectors that didn't have experience.
Mm-hmm.
That was the idea. Hire someone with no experience, but be able to give them the tools to do exactly what a good collector would do. Mm-hmm. So what we did was we took all the pieces of data and created essentially like a dashboard or a screen for the collector to see and see everything they needed to see about this person specifically. So, for example, we would look at open to buy. So, something would get highlighted on the screen that says this person has an open to buy that exceeds the balance of the account. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking two pieces of data, I'm creating a mathematical formula, right? But with a credit bureau, I only have each piece.
Independently.
There's no math there. They're just two snapshots of something. And what we've created was a way to put those together. Just like you're adding all the installment loans, all the mortgage loans together, all that stuff, you're able to do that very quickly. And so, we said, okay, well, since the act of collecting is very fluid, we want to be able to have our collectors sound knowledgeable, like they know their customer, just like in sales. You have to know. They have to know. You have to know what they want, and what they want to hear is what's in it for them, right? And so that's how we present it, and we find information through data crunching and mining to identify those things and then utilize them.
Aris, that is a very insightful way to look at the actual operational use of data analytics. For those of you that are watching, if you have additional questions you'd like to ask Aristotle or myself, you can leave those in the comments below, and we'll be responding to those on LinkedIn and YouTube. If you have additional topics you'd like to see us discuss, you can leave those in the comments below as well. And if I'm lucky, I might be able to get Aristotle to come back at least one more time to help me continue to create great content for a great industry. But until next time, Aristotle, it was great to see you last week at the RMAI conference. Looking forward to seeing you again at CRS in a couple of months.
Thank you for having me. I was glad to be here.
Well, I always appreciate your insights. And for those of you watching, thank you so much for your time and attention today. We'll see you all again soon. Thanks so much, everybody.